And we're live. It is Friday, September 17th, 2021, 5:01 p.m. We are here with our guest, Carla. Carla has written a new book, and we're going to talk about the book. We're not allowed to have fun anymore. And so we are instead allowed to have a conversation with Carla about books about how we're not allowed to have fun anymore. And this is a book about how we're not allowed to have fun anymore. And because we're not allowed to have fun anymore and we're comfortable, we gang up on democracy. And so I want to start this conversation, Tom Nichols and Carla, with the observation that normally when I read a book that accuses people of decadence, and that observes that society is decadent, that is an argument for authoritarianism. You know, I'm thinking of Yukio Mishima or the French and German writers of the 20s, the pro-fascist writers who were all about talking about how society was decadent and we needed a Führer to, you know, return us to spirit, right? This is the first book I have ever read that is accusing us of decadence and concluding from it that the consequence of that decadence is a threat to democracy. And so I want to start by asking you, were you aware of, when you were writing this, of the sort of long tradition of authoritarians accusing the populace of decadence and turning that to an argument for authoritarianism? And were you sort of self-consciously playing on that form?
I wasn't self-consciously, you know, to say a book accusing people of decadence while I'm sitting here like Blofeld.
I was going to say, you're a little bit like, you're kind of like, what is the guy, what's the Dr. Evil? Like, or,
yes, Mr. Bond.
Blofeld, yes. Mr. Bond dies swiftly.
I have concluded, Mr. Bond, that decadence, democratic society cannot survive decadence. And so has Mr. Bigglesworth here. I didn't self-conscious. All right, I'm going to put you down. Is that all right?
We have to get Mike Pesca's naked cat to Tom Nichols somehow. Because that's yeah.
I didn't consciously play on that, but I was very blocked in the book when I was writing it that I was making this argument. I know. You're going to let you go on. There you go. I was very conscious in the book that I was making an argument about decadence, and I was uncomfortable making it because it's not really comfortable to turn to your fellow citizens and say, you're the problem. You know, it's, I didn't, let me just get this pushed away. There we go. I wasn't really comfortable with turning to people and saying, you know, I am so virtuous that I can just tell all of you that you are living bad lives or something. And so I was conflicted about it. And I didn't want to make the argument I'm covered in fur. I didn't want to make the argument that decadence can be remedied with authoritarianism. Because I think having studied the old Soviet Union and having studied a lot of authoritarian governments, authoritarianism does not cure decadence. It makes it worse. There was
I'm not making an argument about authoritarianism. I'm making an argument about intellectuals who accuse the population of decadence. That is usually in the service of an argument for authoritarianism.
No, what I'm saying is that
you are turning it into... you're turning the argument on its head, which is that the decadent population is striving for meaning through authoritarianism and is losing faith in democracy.
Right. What I'm saying is I was aware of the argument that decadence can be remedied with authoritarianism. And I'm saying I wasn't trying to riff on it or play off of it simply because I know that authoritarianism actually deepens decadence. And so this is what I was trying to warn about. And I did turn it on its head to say, it's authoritarianism is the outcome of decadence rather than the remedy for decadence. And I didn't use the word decadence that often because I guess having studied the old Soviet Union, again, that was
you're a little embarrassed by it.
Yeah, and also because it's got such a kind of a Soviet ring to it. You decadent Western, filthy capitalist, bourgeois, decadent, yada yada. And I guess and also because in a way, we are not decadent in the classic sense of opulence. We've become decadent in a kind of grubby, small way, which is why at the end of the book, I invoke the proles from 1984. We're not decadent. We're not living through an era of, flappers and Model Ts and gilded, Gatsbys. Even our
which would be awesome.
Which would be cool. But even our wealthiest guy, even the Bezos and Branson types, pretend to be kind of ordinary Joes, in some way. It's almost like we're the decadence that I'm talking about is the kind of grubby, sort of small, petty, corrupt, self-centered, narcissistic decadence that comes from the middle and the working class rather than the super rich. Again, like not it's not like the Rockefellers and the Pullmans of their era, being ridden around in sedan chairs. It's us having 4 televisions and 2 computers and 2 cars and and then saying, I'm so screwed, I'm so broke, life is so hard. It was that kind of decadence, because what happens is we get so accustomed to that standard of living, and we regard it as an entitlement that whenever things don't go our way or we don't get things we want, we blame not just a government or politicians, we blame the system of government itself. We say democracy has failed us. And I'm okay with saying Joe Biden failed us, Donald Trump failed us, or Nancy Pelosi screwed me over and didn't pass the right bill. That's all normal stuff. It's when people start saying things like, this whole notion of liberal, secular, tolerant democracy sucks because it doesn't reward me adequately in the way I think I should be rewarded.
All right, so I want to poke at some aspects of the thesis here. But before I do,
I want to stake out just before you say this, I want to just say that I'm going to stake out for at some point in the conversation, I want to come back to the idea of blame and the search for blame. Because I have some thoughts.
Actually, let's start there. Go
ahead.
Really? Yeah, because that's antecedent to some of the questions I have.
So I think I kind of, so Tom, I love this idea because I am also, I've looked at this from a cognitive science perspective, which is like, why do we have an impulse to blame? And I had studied this when I was in undergrad and a little bit when I was in grad school, but I kind of came back to it actually around the German wings disaster, which I don't know I think I might have mentioned this before, but that was the one where the pilot just with no warning crashed into the side of a mountain and no sign that he was really depressed. No sign but the headlines around this were we have there has to be someone to blame. And it was this massive churning of trying to find someone to blame. And at some point, okay, well, we can obviously he's gone. So he becomes an unpleasant, he's not a very useful person to blame. We want someone that we can hold up and take a lesson from and kind of correct a system around. And this is this whole kind of recursive system of blame. And there's a bunch of different models that are in competition in cognitive science. But I think it's I think if we stop and think about it and realize that's what we're doing, I think it's I think it's a useful exercise, because I just find that right now, I mean, just for one example, I think we blame so much crap on social media. And like, why aren't we blaming this on government? Or why aren't we blaming this on other people that are doing it? Or like the people that, like the Christchurch video, like everyone, when they had the live shooting, Facebook took 45 minutes to take it down. And I did a whole story about this for the New Yorker, about the team that ended up chasing it around the world to get this video taken down on Facebook, and the people who kept reposting it to keep it going and keep it up. The trolls from 4chan. And like one of the people I interviewed was like, do you know how many people viewed that video before we had the first flag on the video of it being like graphically violent material? It was like 14,000 people looked at that video before anyone even flagged it as being offensive. Like, why are all those 14,000 people not to blame?
I had exactly the same kind of thought you did, Kate, the other day when I noticed that I don't know, a month ago, when someone said, it's been 2 years or 3 years or whatever it's been since the Las Vegas shooting. And they said, and the government still hasn't given us a reason why he did it. The government, right? It's the government's fault that it has not said. And I'm looking at this and saying, or just stay with me here. Maybe there's no reason that the government can. Maybe the guy was just cracked and a screwed up, lost, soulless human being who, in some paranoid recesses of his brain, decided to go kill a bunch of people. That does happen. And this notion that, no, I live in a world where everything can be explained, everything has a reason, and that means everything has a solution. And if there isn't, then I blame the government. And you saw this with the Las Vegas shooting, and you even saw it with 9/11, because it's like, this is why there are conspiracy theories about 9/11. No, it can't just be that 19 guys with box cutters could take over airplanes. That is too random and too scary. Therefore, there has to be some much larger conspiracy and explanation, because otherwise I'm left with living with the randomness of the world, and the government's job is to tell me the world isn't random and that I'm protected and that people are looking out for me. So don't tell me there's no reason.
That's the end of the cognitive science argument. That's like the end of people do this because they can't live with denialism, like the lack of answers.
Well, sorry, but I was going to just to add, to make a literary, pirouette here. When I wrote The Death of Expertise, I brought up the passage from the brothers Karamazov, the suffering of children. Would you subscribe to a God who thinks it's necessary to crush children under the carts of rich men? No, I can't. I can't accept it. Well, the idea that sometimes just bad stuff happens, I think we used to be, and this comes back to the themes in the book, we used to be a more stoic society about things like this.
Right. So I want to explore with you why in your framework in the book we come to be less so. And you start with an interesting place, which is that we don't know how to handle prosperity. You start with the idea that, hey, we're unable to face the fact that things are pretty good. So we tell ourselves all kinds of narratives that deny how good the environment is, not the environmentalism environment, but the environment in which we live. So explain for us the need to deny that we're living in a very good time and that things are actually much better than they used to be, including recently, including in the ages we look back to.
Okay, so there's several pieces of this, and in the book I talk about the problem of nostalgia, and I'm actually not the only one that talks about this. Anne Applebaum in Twilight of Democracy talks about it. That's where I borrowed the idea of restorative nostalgia, which is Svetlana Boym's idea that nostalgia is not just about an imagined past, but it's an imagined past that's been taken away from you by people you can then scapegoat for it. So there's a bunch of things going on. One is psychologically, and Kate probably knows this better than I do. I mean, psychologically, people don't like to say that they're living in decent times because they don't want to jinx it. They feel like it's just bad luck to say, times aren't so bad. My dad used to talk about this with the Greek immigrants that had made it rich in America. He said, no matter what he was talking about one guy he knew made pizzas, and he said, the guy's a millionaire. And he says, no matter when you ask him, if you say, so how was business this year? He'd say, it could be a little better. Not so sure. It might be, it's like the guy never said ever. There was never a year he was in business. He said, yeah, I had a pretty good year. Things are okay. It was always, because we live in fear of that. Now, I think my dad's generation, it was easier for them to say we're living in good times because they had lived through the Depression. So it was really hard. I mean, if you were alive, if you were a middle-aged man in the 1970s or 80s, you didn't really say, 1930, those were some good times. You just couldn't. It was simply not possible to say that. So I think part of it is a long, unbroken stretch of prosperity. You don't really have the correct reference points to be able to say whether things are good or bad. It's just as good as it is. And what you're really thinking about are the things you don't have, because you haven't lived through a period where you've had to come back from something terrible. Now, I know people are going to say, the Great Recession. That actually is not a particularly good reference point. It's the SNL crisis. I mean, it's not a Great Depression situation. It's not even the late 70s.
Because it's not that protracted.
It wasn't that protracted, and it hit particular sectors of the economy in particular ways. No matter, again, people are going to get mad at me for saying this, and because it ended in a relatively fast way with government action, and there's still reverberations through the economy. But the fact is, we're living in a time of a labor shortage and a very high standard of living, and we have been for years. Even the data and in the book, I point to data that says, the early 2000s that everybody thinks was this big China shock. Turns out maybe not. Incomes actually grew pretty fast. Working class families did reasonably well. None of this means there are no problems. None of this means that houses aren't expensive or college isn't expensive. Healthcare is pricey. But this notion that we are living in the worst time becomes internalized because it's a way of saying that the things that I want and that I don't have are being denied to me by somebody else. Because there is no, there's two parts of this. One is that we do not live with gratitude anymore. We simply don't have any sense of kind of gratefulness for the standards of living we live under. The other, and this comes from without, opportunistic political entrepreneurs across the spectrum, but especially concentrated on the right now, are pushing the idea that these are the worst times ever, that you are under siege, that you are miserable. It's almost like they're convincing you to be miserable against, it's like, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? Trust me, you are miserable. Your life is a wreck. And that grievance is because nobody runs for office. And I say this in the book, nobody runs for office saying, you know what? Things are good, but they could be better. I could do better than the next guy. I can be marginally better than the guy I'm running against. People catastrophize politics. It's like, if you don't elect me, your kids are going to be sleeping in the street. you're going to be in a gulag. Your house is going to be taken. I was talking to a colleague, a very, upstate New York, conservative blue collar family. He's a professor, but he still, lives near the family. His dad is a well-off retired guy. And he said, I have to vote for Republicans because the Democrats are going to take all my money the minute I die. And, it's like, because things are so bad and they have to fund the government because we're all broke and everything's miserable. And he's looking, he's saying, Dad, what are you talking about? Where do you, but I place that blame heavily on political entrepreneurs who have a vested interest in telling young people that this is the worst time that anybody could possibly be alive, and telling old people you had it so much better 40 years ago and you're being screwed. And there's just it's not true. It's true in the individual for some people, right? There are people alive now saying, yes, I was better off 35 years ago. Well, okay, but that's simply not in the aggregate true for America or the world. And to believe that is almost an act of will. I tell it, and then I'll shut up about this, but I tell a story in the book where one of my friends from childhood says, I remember when that because we grew up on the same street. So I remember when that was full, and it was full of guys working, and it was bustling. And I said, you can't possibly remember that. We were little kids. We broke the windows in that factory because it was empty. I said, look, you literally are having a false memory. Like it's a recovered, this is like, like the McMartin scandal or something. You're having this like recovered memory of something that didn't happen. And he kind of looked at me. He almost shook his head like it was like physically uncomfortable level of cognitive dissonance. But I think that's where we are now, where we have just all convinced each other that we are in the most utter misery that we've ever experienced. And I personally, I find it, having lived through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, I'm 60 years old. I mean, it's just laughable that when people talk about this as the worst time ever, but I think we're just in that cul-de-sac now.
That was wonderful. I have so many things to say. I will start with the cul-de-sac and the political thing, and then work my way to kind of the more basic kind of premises. But so first of all, I agree with you so much on this idea that like that politicians are incentivized. I want to also just point this out. They're incentivized to create this. And I saw this really great graphic that it was very politically incorrect of me to like in 2008, but it was basically like a graphic of all of the presidential signs and they all were like change, like different words for change, like, and they're all, because that's what they run on. They run on change, right? If you're running against an incumbent, you're running on change. And like, so too is like a liberal running against whatever the base is of the person who's left. So this is like, I think that this is exactly right. And the other thing that this brings up about in terms of blame is that if the government is getting blamed for things and politicians spend half their life taking blame for when things go wrong in their district or generally or whatever, this is why they love social media right now and tech companies, because it is such a good distractor and such a good way to score easy points, because it's like right now it seems like the only thing people hate more than government is social media. So no matter what side you're on, you can go to bat against the big tech companies.
And just to be more precise in the language, the problem isn't when people blame the government, because sometimes you should blame the government. Yes. Government, sometimes governments pass dumb laws or enact stupid policies, or, just look, elected politicians are like all other human beings. Sometimes they screw the pooch. It's when people blame the idea of government and the idea of liberal democracy. Like if we weren't allowed to, if somebody would punish the other people, this wouldn't happen to me.
Yes.
That's when democracy falls apart. It's like, so this factory, and I'm watching some of the scroll go by. You know why factories closed in the Northeast? because it's cold and snowy, and they were old, and those factories closed in the 70s. Some of them closed in the 80s. It wasn't anybody's fault. It's the way of the world, especially for Americans who want a lot of stuff cheap. There was a huge flap in my hometown. My hometown was, once upon a time, the world headquarters of Spalding. If you've ever seen the movie Men in Black 2 or 3, where they're at a game and the guy even says, the time-shifting creature says, that ball was made in Chicopee, Massachusetts. In the 70s, it became this huge thing that Spalding was now going to make baseballs in Haiti. My God, America's sports. And the guy said, this is like 1974, and he said, look, I can't sell baseballs that are stitched. I literally can't. You won't pay for a baseball that's been stitched by an American worker by hand. You're just not going to do it. And I can't afford it. And, and of course the answer, my friends back home are like, well, the company should take less profit. Well, companies aren't in the business of, and I said, especially, that's easy to say when you're 20 and not 60 with a 401k. All of a sudden the retirees are like, no. The bottom line is people don't want to pay a lot of money for a baseball stitched by an American worker who needs, a healthcare plan to do it. So baseball's moved offshore, like TVs and a lot of other things. In the book, I point out, we have never come to grips with ourselves as a society that has avidly chosen consumerism.
All right, so I want to propose a different explanation for the rise of contented armchair right-wing anti-democratic people, which may appeal to your Sovietologist roots. So we have a latent...
Go ahead, we're listening.
Yeah, we have a latent racism
the NSA is listening.
More latent than other times. And the Cold War actually acted as something of a suppressant to it. Mm-hmm. Because, boy, if you hated the commies enough, you didn't want a whole lot of internal division to get in the way of that. And so, you were willing to, from, quite conservative to quite liberal, there was a kind of consensus on a certain kind of tolerance that allowed certain progress to happen. Soviet Union falls apart, and it turns out for the right, it is really, really important to have an enemy. And so conveniently, after working with Bill Clinton as the enemy, Bill and Hillary Clinton served that function in much of the 90s, overseas Islamists become, for a time, a very useful target in that regard. But eventually, it migrates back to its, kind of what is deepest in the American soul in this regard, which is kind of good old-fashioned bigotry. And the longer you give it, the more it tends to migrate to that. So within 15, 20 years of the fall of the Soviet Union, you have a lot of armchair white people who are worried about their race status and giving political voice to race status issues. And that is really a big part of the story of the rise of anti-democratic which is the same old story. It's the same constituency that had anxieties that give rise to, the Tulsa race riot. Actually, right? It's people afraid of people afraid of racial equity, and that has a lot more to do with the story than the book acknowledges. I'm curious for your thought. We don't have the Soviet Union. We're not allowed to have the Soviet Union anymore, but we can still have good old-fashioned racism.
I start from the same place you do, and I diverge a bit, in part because if this were just a story about America, that's a really strong explanation. It does not explain Italy, India, Poland, the UK, Brazil, Hungary, and it's all happening at the same time. So the idea that it's like the illiberal middle class is just this kind of racially anxious, which it is in the United States. I mean, I think that everything you said, the illiberal middle class in the United States is basically a bunch of middle-aged, well-off white guys. That is like the demo for the kind of illiberal movement in the United States. That and younger men, and it's overwhelmingly men, but that and younger men who feel like the world has simply not paid them enough respect, because we live in this kind of fucked up respect culture now that is all about unearned esteem. And I talked about this in The Death of Expertise, and I think it's an emanation of this narcissistic society that we've developed, that we're all about esteem, but not about actually earning it. Where I think I diverge from you is, you're right that the civil rights coalition in the United States is in part kept together because we don't want to look bad in front of the Soviets. We're saying, hey, democracy, freedom, and when the Soviets say, "A u vas negrov lynchuyut," this standard Soviet expression, and you lynch Negroes, and we kind of go, yeah, okay, well, we got to stop doing that if we want to win the Cold War, because that looks bad, and it is bad. When the Cold War goes away, I think something even worse happens, which is that we lose any sense of seriousness about politics. The Cold War, for both the right and the left, put kind of guardrails on. I mean, it's even more than just not, that great Star Trek line, Captain, not in front of the Klingons, But there was also these guardrails that said, look, you cannot have utterly unserious politicians involved in this, because, global apocalypse is at stake here. There is an alternative model of organization. You guys you're giving me you're going to give me a seizure here.
Someday Crowdcast will fix this. That you can't.
It's the worst. It's so
you can't bring somebody on screen without them flashing up on
screen. So that goes away, and suddenly it's like, why not Bernie Sanders? Why not Donald Trump? Why not Marianne Williamson? Why not any of these, goofy candidates? And this stuff, why not Ross Perot? Right? I mean, people that would not have gotten traction until the 1990s. When you could say, yeah, what's the worst that could happen? We're the most powerful country in the world. Everything's, it's not the idea that you would have to say, can you envision Ross Perot on the phone with Brezhnev goes away. Which was a big guardrail in the way we dealt with politics for 50 years. That aside, I think you're right that democracies, I think, tend to need an awareness of the existence of what an undemocratic world looks like. And the Soviets constantly gave us that. Even China now, I always say this, if you ask young people, China, oh yeah, didn't Batman jump off one of those cool glass towers in Shanghai? I saw that in a movie. There's nothing scary about the notion of China or, North Korea. We play it for laughs. Iran is far away and we don't understand it. We don't have an alternative model that reminds us that democracy is an act of will, that democracy is not self-sustaining, and that the inertia, or the, what am I trying to say, that the steady state in a dangerous world
it's not a given.
Is that right? It's not a given, that we kind of, that we're an unstable thing that can decay into authoritarianism if we're not constantly nurturing this. I feel like I'm doing Chance the Gardener. Gardens don't grow by themselves. The house doesn't stay warm on its own. But I think that after the 90s, we lose that. And I know people really object to this notion of prosperity and affluence, but even within my own lifetime, the amount of just base level affluence and living standards has been so dramatic, so fast, that we have developed a kind of gigantic sense of hedonic adaptation, which means hedonic adaptation is when
you talked about this last time you were on the show. I've used it like 5 times.
Yeah, the standard of living you're at becomes the minimum you can tolerate. And I was thinking about this, and I'll just, I'll use a really shishi elitist example. I used to drink cheap wine, right? So, hell yeah, $10 a bottle for some, Bola or Ernest and Julio. Later on, you learned, like, your tastes become educated. You say, wow, this is a really good Cabernet. Suddenly, all that other stuff tastes like swill. Something you drank when you were 25, you'd say, boy, this is really good. And all of a sudden, you're 45 and you're going...
No, I mean, it is so true that
it is such a true statement.
The people who insist that living standards have not increased in the United States,
they're just wrong.
They make a point of excluding a whole lot of data that shows precisely the opposite. It is simply untrue.
There is no way to make that. I didn't mean to interrupt, Kate, but there is no way to make that argument. It is so dumb that it just fails on its face, and even trying to stratify it by class or income, people, what a lot of people fall back on, and where I think some people will criticize the book, they say, yes, but you're not taking into account income inequality. Well, inequality is a question of justice. It's not a question of living standards.
Right. Yes.
If we're all millionaires,
yes,
and there's 10 billionaires, then we have a tremendous inequality. But it doesn't mean we're not millionaires.
You just really well summed up a dinner party that John and I were at, like my partner and I were at, like 5 years ago, and someone said almost exactly this, and John responded like, no, like that is like wrong. Things are better. It is measurably better. And they were like, no. And then like I just had to kick him under the table because I'm like, you're going to ruin this dinner. But I think
here's a thought exercise. Ask somebody, how do you think you're, without anything else, how are you doing? I'm okay. I got a car, got a house, or I'm living in an apartment. I'm, whatever. Say, your boss makes 50 times what you do. Wow, now I'm unhappy, right? Then say, oh, I'm sorry, that's a typo. He makes 5,000 times what you do. All of a sudden, you're going to say, my life sucks. 10 minutes ago, you might have been have a kind of normal level of class resentment. And one of the things I point out in the book is that people really cannot grasp that level of wealth. So
no.
they think they understand that level of inequality. But what we find, what you'll actually see in American society, is that we direct our anger at the people that are closer to us in income rather than farther away. We're not mad
your neighbor.
We're not mad at Jeff Bezos for, and somebody pointed out, these guys shot themselves into space, but they said, look, we're philanthropists. We're picking up the space program. I personally thought it was stupid and irresponsible. It was like watching 9-year-old boys buy themselves rockets.
Yeah.
But instead of directing our anger at those guys, we go on Zillow. It is literally a thing that people surf Zillow, checking out the prices of their neighbors' homes. We're not really sitting around saying, well, those super rich CEOs, you don't go and look up where you're looking down the street and saying, Hey, I went by a raised ranch that I saw for sale today, and it's in my neighborhood. How come that guy's house is worth this? We have become, and I think, Kate, some of it goes back to social media. We have become this innately resentful society about everything. We walk around with huge amounts of resentment about everyone around us because we are in touch with them too often. We are spending too much of our lives looking at each other's lives.
Well, this is okay. So I will make 2 quick points, and then I will have Genevieve's questions, and then we're going to go to questions. But my first point is that yes, there is too much information. We are really, literally not built to grok or understand or take in all of this information, and we are let's even set aside comparing our lives and our standard of living. We are exposed to seeing more and worse atrocities in a worse way than we ever were before. They were all happening before. We just weren't seeing them and and we can do just about as little about any of those in the day to day. And so we have this profound, to get back to the blame idea, we have a profound sense of absolute a poverty of power. We have no ability to go off and change how this thing is happening, or these how to more effectively evacuate the Afghani nationals that are trapped there. So I mean, anyways, but so there's that. The other thing I just want to get back to really quickly with the point about what was it? It was restorative nostalgia, or yeah. So this restorative nostalgia idea, I was just thinking about how you, even in the example that you gave. So one of the things that I actually think is just true, and at an individual level and then collectively as a society, is you go through life and you have again, you are just exposed to more and more and more pain and suffering as you go through life, and more difficulty. You are cared for and have almost very little liberty, and you gain more liberty, and then you kind of have problems and issues and expectations on you, and your parents die and bad things happen, and you see more of it. But the other thing is that when you start to do basic cognitive measuring, when you take your kid, you have to go and send your kid off to college. You say to yourself, well, what did I pay when I went to college? Well, first of all, you probably didn't. Your parents paid or something else. But and you kind of do these two measures, and it seems like there's been this huge growth in the price. It's so there's these cherry picking of examples. There's a whole bunch of cognitive biases and kind of heuristics that we're leaning on that kind of create and add to why nostalgia is powerful. Of course, it's always going to look better when you look back at whatever the hell you think happened when you were a child. You just had less going on, probably.
And also, it's easy for me to say, you know what a good year was? 1981. Well, the reason it wasn't a good year. Unemployment was 9%. Inflation was high. Country. I would say the period from 1973 to 1983 was about the worst decade I lived through. But you know why I like 1981? I was 21 years old when I was in college, and I had a really nice girlfriend.
Exactly.
And it's okay, to me it seemed fine, but that doesn't mean it's fine. The cherry picking of nostalgia, I talk about this in the book. If I hear one more person say, well, if we take 1970 as a benchmark, okay, let's take 1970 as a benchmark where, you're a white working class. First of all, in 1970, that was the year of the hard hat riots, where white working class guys said, this sucks. No one listens to us. The working class is downtrodden. It was so much better in 1950. 1970, you could afford a 3-bedroom apartment in the west side of Manhattan or Hell's Kitchen, where you could raise your 2 kids.
But you might find a dead body on your way to school, as I did that year.
One TV,
look how
one
much
phone.
You've gotten out of that story. My God.
I am totally down with it because it's been such a good. I've gotten so much mileage out of the story.
Somebody's doing it already. My first college apartment, Bob. Look, when I started college in 1979, one reason college was cheaper? Nobody went. 14% of American women went to college in 1980.
Yeah, this is what equality gets you.
In 1970, those were great times. Wouldn't it be great to be a woman again and have to ask your husband's permission to get a car loan? Wouldn't it be great to be black in 1970?
restrictive covenants, baby. Couldn't
You know,
even, like,
sure. Hey,
land.
but I grew up with affordable housing. Yes, built by William Levitt with restrictive covenants and sold. By the way, how did my grandparents afford it? Well, I don't know. Your grandfather got drafted and had to go fight a war and got the GI Bill. That's one way to afford it.
Yeah.
But all that stuff gets wiped. That's like memory wiped when we start talking about, yes, but in 1970, a blue collar worker could earn X dollars. Yes, as Kevin Williams, I'm sure not somebody who's real popular with this crowd, but as Kevin Williamson once said, you can have a 1957 lifestyle just like your parents and very cheaply. But you really, you know, and he doesn't add this part, but I say his point is you really have to commit to the bit if you're going to live a 1957 lifestyle. You know, no car, only public transportation, one TV, 3 channels, 1 phone, no air conditioning, you know, 600 square feet in an apartment. I mean, you really got to eat that whole shit sandwich.
Jello mold sandwich. All
right, I want to go to audience
what people
questions.
want today is 2021's lifestyle at 1971's prices.
All right, I want to go to audience questions. But before we do that, Genevieve has questions that Kate is going to read.
Yes. Okay, so Genevieve is not here because she had a baby on Monday. And so, but she is listening to your book on Audible, and she's not done yet, but she wants to know, how long did it take you to record it? And did any of your reflections in the book change as you read it out loud?
First, thank you, because I was very nervous about recording the book. I really wanted to record it because so much of it is autobiographical, and so much of it was very personal. And while the wonderful Sean Pratt read my last one, I really made a pitch to Oxford and to the company to say, I need to read this book. So I've been very insecure about that. I don't actually like my own speaking voice, which you would think an egomaniac like me would, but I don't. It took me 2 full days at a studio in Boston with about a couple of hours afterwards for pickups and retakes. So the studio time was like 2 8-hour days. It's one of the hardest things I ever did. And it's hard to record a book. Nothing in my mind changed. I didn't read it and hear it out loud and say, I wish I hadn't said that. What I really noticed, and this is a really prosaic and boring observation, I noticed that my sentences tend to be a little too long, and that there were a lot of typos in the book that I didn't catch until I read them out loud.
Interesting.
All right. Daniel Burge. Backlit as ever. The floor is yours.
So I am wondering, for the panel's hunches about what's going to happen Saturday at the right-wing rally in D.C. So on the one hand, we have reports that the online chatter is a bit like before January 6th, according to the FBI. But on the other hand, this is being organized by a group that doesn't get great turnout usually. So I'm wondering where everyone stands on it.
I'm taking a wild guess and saying that it's a fizzle. That a bunch of people being in jail right now, and I hate to ever predict something, because by saying this, it guarantees that there will be a giant riot tomorrow.
Yeah, like that's what Ben said last time about the January 6th riot.
I have this kind of...
I didn't know. I said they're going to try to storm the Capitol, but if they do, the Capitol Police will be very well prepared.
Sorry.
I had the protesters exactly right. I had law enforcement totally wrong.
Yeah, fair enough.
But there's a part of me that just thinks that a lot of these guys, for all the big talk about we're going to go rally, I mean, the fact that members of Congress are chickening out, like Matt Gaetz, I had a family commitment. I just wonder if a lot of these people are saying, yeah, I totally support this, but I'm not fucking going to jail like those people did the last time. So maybe it's just that the wish is, that I'm just hoping. But there's a part of me that wonders if after all this big talk, because now there is a show. Now the cops are ready. The National Guard is on the scene. You know, if these people want to get arrested and do time, the government will more than happily accommodate them. And I'm just curious about how many of them really are going to show up and say, yes, I'm willing to go to jail for this. And I don't think it's going to be as much. On the other hand, you could get it both ways, right? You don't get a lot of turnout from the people that are kind of the rank and file, but there may be some very dedicated people who are going to plant bombs. I mean, I think we're due for I suspect that no matter what happens, there is going to be another Timothy McVeigh event somewhere because of Trump, basically.
What do you think, Kate?
I have no idea. All I know is that just as an interesting side note in terms of blame, Airbnb, whenever something like this starts happening, they don't really talk about it. They do background searches on all of the people in the area who have rented homes in like the area to like come in for the event, and then they cancel them and they pay the host and they pay the people back and they dehome them because they don't want the blame of it being part of the news story that like so and so that set a pipe bomb at like the such and such event rented an Airbnb with a group of 8 other like neo-Nazis, and Airbnb did nothing about it. So anyway,
I will just say I think Tom's analysis is very likely right.
yeah,
It is actually hard to turn out a lot of people to Washington. It takes a lot of organization. Groups that have limited history of doing it should not be presumed to be capable of doing it in large numbers on first attempt. Law enforcement is, look, I said this last time, so take this with a grain of salt, unlikely to be caught flat-footed a second time.
And not this time.
And I do think this is the sort of thing that is also the number of people who were deeply sympathetic to the 1/6 indictees is smaller than the number of people who were deeply sympathetic to the idea that the election was stolen. And so I think the universe of people to draw on is relatively small. And the one caveat I will give is that people, I do also agree that it tends to concentrate the hardest of the hardcore who are most likely to be violent.
That's my point. That the people who are going to show up are going to be crackpots, and they'll probably target stuff that's away from the Capitol because they know that the Capitol is being watched, and but they'll I wouldn't want to be on the Metro.
So, and if you live in this area and you want to do a good deed, keep an eye on the black church in your neighborhood because, as I said in December and January, often when these people come to town and they can't do the thing that they wanted to do, they then turn to targets of opportunity, which are often, obviously gay or trans people in the street, and buildings associated with generally black churches.
But I'm gonna say one other thing that I know sometimes riles people up, but I don't mean to. But the worst thing that anybody could do is organize a counter protest.
Oh yes,
ignore them. Right. Ignore them. Stay away from them. Make them seem small and petty and stupid.
Don't give them attention.
Don't give them attention. Don't give them a target. Let them march around in circles until they get tired and go home.
Eric Berg, your camera isn't working for reasons I can't determine, but your mic is on, and the floor is yours. Oh, now your camera's working.
There we go. So, especially coming from a state that just went to crisis care standards, yeah. What do you think's the perceived end of this game, of this kind of decadent decay of democracy? Of the idea that people seem to be fine with the elements of democracy working so poorly that basic services are starting to break down. I know some people don't care, but for those like in the GOP who know better, who seem to be okay with it, I just don't understand where they think this all ends up.
I've said many times, if you're Elise Stefanik, where it ends up is that you get to stay in Washington. That's it. I mean, I think, every time I hear Elise Stefanik talk, I hear her saying, I'm not going back to upstate New York.
Hey!
Well, but, I think Elise Stefanik
I'm not going back to upstate New York.
Elise Stefanik is saying, I didn't go to Harvard so that I could be on the town council in Clarksburg. That's not, Josh Hawley. I didn't go to Stanford and Yale so that I could hang out a shingle in Sedalia, Missouri. That's not why I went. I am slated for greater things. And if I have to rile up a bunch of dangerous rubes so that I keep going back to Washington, that's okay. It's not going to affect me. I live in the Emerald City. So what if Idaho? Eric, I guess you're in Idaho, right? I mean, so what if Idaho is, melting down and people are dying in the hallways of hospitals? I don't live in Idaho. I live in Washington, and I'm a member of Congress. That's where I think it goes. I think it is that shallow and opportunistic. And this is always my place where I point out that I'm really glad that I wrote a whole article that boiled down to calling J.D. Vance nasty.
All right. Mike Godwin, the floor is yours. We have 3 more questions. We have 4 more minutes. So I'm going to ask for quick questions and quick answers.
Muted.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
All right, great. So the quick question is it the critique of democracy that just the democracies always suck because people are, pursuing self-fulfillment? This is Plato's argument. Over time, democracies decay because people are pursuing their own interests. There's no unity. There's no common purpose. And is there? So the question is really: do we bring back some kind of communitarianism? What do we do with institutions so that they survive when the worst elected officials are in charge? So that's actually 2 questions, and I'll stop there.
I'm not making the argument that democracies inherently suck and then go down the tubes because people are pursuing their self-interest. That's, what really scares me is that that's the argument being made by by guys like Adrian Vermeule and the Catholic integrationists who are like, we really need a pope, not this pope, of course, but a pope to basically order our lives, and then we will be grateful to the new sovereign who will tell us what to do. I think one of the reasons the American Republic had such longevity is that we were able to unify around an idea, even an imperfectly executed idea, but an idea that was no longer dependent on blood and soil and heritage and ethnicity. And we could simply say that we could all become part of something that is part of the Constitution, and that we could struggle together to keep realizing that idea. And I think what's happened is we've decided that we as a society, all of us from top to bottom, have decided that our own good is more important than anything else, and for a variety of reasons. But I think someone cleverly noted that what I'm really doing is critiquing capitalism, and I am.
Yeah.
This is, it's an awkward place for an old school conservative to be, but this is partly what happens when we commodify and consumerize everything. And we made that choice. I mean, we have to stop blaming the government and corporations and other. We can stop. We're like a society of people that are yelling, "Stop giving us what we want." Stop.
Well, someone should sell that.
Stop listening to us. And I think that's just, and we have it within us to do that, but we have to be self-conscious about it. And that's partly why I wrote the book, to try to make people more self-conscious about this.
The last time I saw Adrian Vermeule, I made the mistake of casually calling him a conservative. He scowled at me and said, "I'm not a conservative, I'm an authoritarian." Lisa, you get the last question today. Apologies to Zunyi, whom I have tried and failed to bring on the screen. We'll figure out what happened, what went wrong, and do it a different time. Lisa, the floor is yours.
That's too bad, because Zunyi's question was great. Anyway,
yeah, maybe I'll read it to close out.
That would be great, because I really liked it. Anyway, my question is, why isn't the 80s thing about there is no society, government is the problem, Ronald Reagan coming and saying that, the government has come to help you and that's what the problem is. Why isn't that at the root of what you're complaining about? Because I, as sort of like your leftist, from Silver Spring or whatever, am like, I've never felt the way you're talking about. And so a lot of us are wondering, who is this we you're talking about? And are the Republicans or former Republicans willing to repudiate that perspective, understanding that it sort of went wrong?
I hope you don't mind if I sigh heavily and say, yes, I know it was all Ronald Reagan. Everything was good before Reagan and Reagan.
The actor? Sorry.
Part of the problem here, and I think the ahistoricity of this argument is that when Reagan said government was the problem, in a 21st century context, that sounds really nihilistic. It sounded really sensible if you had lived through the 1970s. This is the problem. Reagan did not run as the, to be the emperor of the, or the chairman of the Green Lantern Corps in some other universe. It was a direct response to what a lot of people, both on the right and the left, perceived as the serial failures of large government initiatives throughout the late. My mom was a Democrat who worked in a Great Society program. That radicalized her by 1980. My mother, we had a picture of, I say this in the book, we had a picture of Jack Kennedy in the dining room till the day I sold that house in 2012. But working in that program literally radicalized my mom to say, this is we are creating the problem that we think we're solving. And many Americans felt that way. So it's always going back to this touchstone of, because remember, what Reagan didn't say, like, all government is the problem and therefore we should be nihilists. Reagan thought that the government could do a lot of great things, like national defense, for example. So this argument drives me crazy because the consumerist, perpetual, and Lisa, I'm gonna throw some of this on the left. The consumerization of a perpetual youth culture begins on the left in the late 60s and the early 70s. And
if we had let the youth have it, we'd still be drinking New Coke. Okay, Tom. So
New Coke. God, I remember. Wow, what a callback. But this notion that somehow we were this totally virtuous society until Ronald Reagan came in with the flappers and the Gatsbys. I'm sorry, that no one who lived through the 1970s, which was an incredibly, I think in the book I call it oily decadence of the 1970s. The 1970s were hideous, and they were the kind of the karmic fallout of this explosion in the late 60s, and the notion that we are now perpetually organized around being a youth culture. And
as a child of the 1970s, I would just like to say in defense of that decade, absolutely nothing.
I'm sorry, but
it was a terrible decade.
I was watching Saturday Night Fever, which of course is based on a lie in an article that turned out to be false. But just the environmental kind of the mise en scène, can I say that? The kind of whole picture of the 70s. I was watching it with my teenage daughter, and she just kind of looked at me and she's like, "Did this happen? Did the world look this way?" And I was like, "This is the good version."
Yeah.
This is the nice version. You cannot understand what happens in 1980 unless you understand everything that happens in the 15 years before it. And to simply say, well, it was all fine until that is simply not true.
People then.
I will say
in defense
you Americans were decadent from the beginning.
I would just like to say there's only two things that I think are wonderful about the 1970s. One is it gave the world Sesame Street and
Steely Dan.
And there's some good music from the 70s. Number two, it is the early 70s are actually the golden age of movies.
I'd buy that.
You know, the creation of the R rating in 1969 allowed a flourishing of film. Other than that, the entire decade should just go away.
Well, but you know, as a more serious issue of politics, I mean, the people who you know, like me, who were 20 years old and in their first presidential election, I mean, there was really a sense that the country was in complete freefall. And not just, I mean, again, we always think of this in terms of Ronald Reagan and tax cuts and government is a problem. I'm sorry, there was a Cold War going on and we were losing it. There was a palpable sense that we were literally, like the Soviets were putting out headlines saying the correlation of forces has turned in favor of socialism and America is on its way out. And I was sitting in classrooms in 1979 and 1980 with professors who were kind of tenting their fingers and saying, you know what, the Soviets might be right. Might be over for us. We're kind of on the way out.
Just like they're saying now. We are going to leave it there. Tom Nichols, you're a great American. You've written a great book. I really enjoyed it much more than I expected to. Lenin would be proud of you for calling us on our bourgeois decadence. We are going to be back Monday. I have no idea who our guest is going to be. If anybody knows. But Kate, until then.
We're not allowed to have fun anymore. But we are allowed to act like we're really not allowed to have fun anymore, ever.
Fun
and we
is
used to
decadent.
have so much fun, and we'll just have to buy Tom's book instead.
Yeah, fun
So
is
nice
decadent.
to have you
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. Now go buy the book. Mark Levin and Tucker Carlson are still outselling me, and I blame you people for that.
Yeah.
I mean, yes.
Take it away from